Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, Baby Metal and Atarashi Gakko fan. And I was going to talk a little today because a couple of people have asked if I was going to respond to the recent radio interviews that the two groups have done together. This is a Baby Metal hosted project. And at first I thought, well, I don't know that I have a lot to say, but I'm gonna try anyway, because there are things that I found sort of interesting and provocative, and it sent me thinking. After I recorded this video, I found out that Philip Gregory, a dedicated Kitsune loyal supporter of this channel, had recently died, like last week, and so I wanted to dedicate this video to him, who was always, vocally supportive. I corresponded with him a lot through various fan sites and such, and met him a couple of times at shows. He wouldn't agree with everything that I say in this video, but there were a few things in the world that he cared about more than Baby Metal. So, I thought it would be good to just remind everybody of him and of other fans elsewhere whose lives are enriched by their passion for these groups. Rest in peace, Philip. Baby Metal have been doing this, what they call Metaraji, a kind of radio show where they talk about themselves and their interests and introduce metal to other bands and other guests and talk to those guests. And interestingly, tellingly, I hope, the first group that they chose to speak to was Atarashi Gakko, and they did 3 sessions with them. They're quite short, especially when you take out the music, but they did 3 sessions. And the first one was with Canon and Miju from Atarashi Gakko.
今月1月のマンスリーゲストは、メタラジをお聞きの皆さん、こんばんは。新しい学校のリーダーズのミジュとカノンです。よろしくお願いします。よろしくお願いします。
And the second one was with Suzuka and Ren. And then the third one was with all 4 members. And Baby Metal as the hosts kind of play that role of the guest anchor, and the format is very comparable to a lot of sort of Japanese magazine TV shows, those kind of chatty, not exactly hard-hitting journalism, it tends to be fairly light in terms of what the content is focused on. But there was some interesting stuff that came through, and they talked about choreography, which I thought was interesting. The first time they raised it, when they asked Atarashi Gakko how they produced their choreography, because AG do all their own dance stuff themselves, and they talk about how they build the images and get a sense of what the core of the hook of the song is, what the songs are about, and how they translate that into something physical, and how they build out from that, and how long it takes. Sometimes a day, sometimes a month, and how they refine it and they alter it sometimes after performance or if they think it's too close to another song. I found that really interesting to hear how, practical dance artists are working, because that's what Atarashi Gakko are. They are very much dancers, right? And then, when they sort of sent the question back to Baby Metal, it was interesting to hear Baby Metal gave a couple of different answers, because initially they sort of said, oh, well, we're working with a choreographer, and so we bring some things to the table, but the implication was we're not entirely in charge of the process, which we already knew. And then later on, they said, oh, well, we have different dance backgrounds and different influences, and Su Metal has more sort of jazz and ballet, and Moa and Momoko have more sort of K-pop influences and stuff. And so that I thought was quite interesting, because it suggests that they're not simply being told what to do, that their own interests and personalities are shaping something of what they're doing, which I always like. I like to hear that a group has some agency in what they make. And they talk about, goofy stuff like hair and food on the road and things like that. But to me, the interesting stuff, and it's actually the very first question, and I'm not sure about this, but the very first question that was asked in the first session was,
リーダーズとベビーメタルさんがコラボするならどんなことをしたいですか？
逆に聞きたいけれど。
でもあれですね、やっぱ海外で、私たち2組とも海外に進出してるので、日本を飛び出してもう最初から海外でライブするとかしたいですね。台湾ツアーもしたい。
一番最後東京みたいな。
最高帰ってくる。それが一番いいね。
And I asked that question. They allowed you to submit questions in advance, and that was exactly my question. They didn't say who the questions came from, and I'm sure other people asked the question, so I'm not claiming credit for it. But to me, that was the heart of these 3 interviews. And initially, I was really excited about the way that they answered that question, because they seemed genuinely interested in some kind of collaboration. They talked about some sort of joint foreign tour concluding in Tokyo, which would be awesome. That would be fantastic. They also talked about the possibility of doing a song together.
楽曲とかでね、コラボレーションできたらいいよね。
一緒に歌って踊ってメタル教えてもらってなんか
ヘドバンしてね。
そうだね。ついてる回してね。
ついてましたね。
確かに回したいですね。
できることいっぱいありそうですね。楽しみ。
Now, I don't know to what extent this is just spitballing, to what extent they're saying the things that they think the fans might want to hear, and to what extent Baby Metal are often very deliberate in what they do. Maybe there is something already in the works, and they're using this to either prime the pumps or test the waters or whatever metaphor you would like. But I do think it's really interesting, and it set me wondering about how these 2 bands might work together. I've seen fans talking about how they're sick of Baby Metal collaborating and they just want them to do their own album, and I get that. That's fine. But I also think that there are differences between collaborating where they are featured on somebody else's album and the kind of collaboration which they have always done with instrumentalists and other artists, in which it's their song and there are other people on it, and it appears on their album, like Papaya, for example. But one of the things that struck me about prior collaborations is that, Baby Metal have never collaborated with another female artist except for Distortion with Alicia White Glues. I never know how to pronounce her name. Though, her voice is so sort of, the growly metal shouty voice that it's not clearly feminine at all. And I think that's sort of interesting because both Atarashi Gakko and Baby Metal, when they collaborate with a male vocal, it tends to force their vocal participation into a certain kind of feature, right? And by contrast with the sort of heavier, darker sound of the male voice, and Baby Metal become the kind of the more ethereal, lyrical, melodic part of the song. And Atarashi Gakko did something similar with Maximum the Hormone, which is really their only true metal collaboration to date. I thought that was a terrifically successful song. Now, the song that they did with Maximum the Hormone, Shimmy, was a song that already existed, and it already existed with a female vocal part in it. So there was a sense in which Atarashi Gakko was stepping into something that was already there, though they also added Rin's rap part, which I thought, gave an extra dimension to the song. But I do think it would be kind of interesting to see what happens if Baby Metal and AG were to collaborate on a song where you then have female voices working together, and they would have to think of a different way to set them apart. Now, obviously, you're dealing with quite different voices. Su Metal's voice has that kind of mid-range power. Suzuka from Atarashi Gakko tends to go a little lower. The register is a little deeper, a little richer. And then you've got the sort of lighter voices of Miju and Kanon, which would suit Momoko and Moa. So I think, that there's an interesting sort of range of possibilities in terms of the way the voices would work together. And obviously when Baby Metal have collaborated with other people, and even when they're just sort of making songs of their own, they have been very generically experimental. And I would love to see what came out of a collaboration with AG, who have also been experimental, though at the moment their sound has been sort of a little bit more digital and a little bit poppier and hip-hop driven. Though, early on they were much more sort of jazz influenced, though there's a lot of sort of Showa era pop in their stuff as well. And I actually think that, this is a really interesting potential pairing. They were talking about, in the radio show, they said, there's obviously quite a lot of overlap in the fan bases, which I think they were sort of surprised by that. Atarashi Gakko was saying people show up at their shows wearing Baby Metal gear. And I'm not entirely sure what I think about that, because, anything that lumps all Japanese stuff together makes me uncomfortable, particularly if it's all Japanese female stuff. When people say to me, oh, you like Baby Metal, you must love Bandmaid or Nemophila and Love Bites. And the answer for me is always no. Sorry, but I don't. But I do think that there's some interesting overlap between these two groups. And I keep trying to pinpoint what it is. And it's something about a shared ethos, I think, which is very distinctly Japanese and supportive and mutual and female, of course, but which also is pushing at stereotypes and expectations in interesting ways and in different ways. Baby Metal have always had this sort of epic, grand pageantry associated with their big shows particularly, and you hear it in the songs, and particularly in their lyrics. there's this sense of, if you had to identify the most recurring theme in a baby metal song, it's some form of standing up against encroaching darkness, I think. The nature of that darkness is rarely specified, but it's a very Gambari Masho kind of impulse. Things in the world are dark and difficult, but you fight on, which is a sentiment I appreciate. I don't know that there is a comparable common theme within Atarashi Gakko, though I think one has emerged more in recent years, where there's an emphasis on the frustrations of modern life and the difficulties and the sense of being restricted and the need to escape that in a way which is both individualistic in certain respects, but also mutually supportive, particularly in terms of lifting up people who are in some ways downtrodden. And I think that this is an angle of approach that both bands have, a sense of a mutually supportive inclusivity, a desire to celebrate and lift up, which I think is distinct and unusual and particular to both groups. I'm sure other groups do it as well, but I think this is a strong positive through line with both, and both have particular kinds of energy. If there's a difference between the two, Atarashi Gakko, I think, are a little bit more punk. I said this when I started making videos about Atarashi Gakko like 4 years ago, I'm not going to say before anybody else, but kind of, yeah. At least as far as Western commentators were concerned, there were a few lyric videos and things like that, but nobody was talking about them. I was talking about them 4 years ago. And one of the things that I said then was that I thought of them as a punk band. And I don't mean that in terms of them being sort of shouty and sounding like the Sex Pistols or the Ramones. But I do think that their sense of themselves as somehow outside and opposed to elements of contemporary culture and society and pushing back against things, a very punk impulse. And I immediately connected to that. I always liked that. I liked the sort of social specificity of some of their complaints, some of the things that what they're talking about and how we have to sort of push back against it. And baby metal rarely do that. When they did do it, it tended to be focused on stuff that seemed age appropriate when they were younger, like, for example, bullying, right? Ijime Dame Zettai is a very specific song. It talks about a particular social problem. And it was a real social problem, is a real social problem, particularly for people of high school age, right? That song emerged out of incidents in Japan in which students were committing suicide because of bullying. So it's not a throwaway, it's not a disposable, it's not a cute song. I think it's quite earnest and serious. But I think as they've got older, they have kind of retreated, and and they're not doing most of the songwriting, of course, but I think they have backed away from real issues and gone into a kind of high epic mode, which sometimes I really like, and sometimes with the state of the world as it is, sometimes I want to know what we're fighting against, and I want to hear it. And there are flashes of it in baby metal, in a song like Road of Resistance, where they're talking about standing up and fighting for justice. And I can really get behind that. Though I'd like to hear them talk a little bit more about what brand of justice we're thinking of. And I think that there's a little bit more specificity in Atarashi Gakko's socially driven impulses, which I would kind of like to hear more of. And I would love to see what happens if those two impulses were brought together in a single collaboration. Again, I understand that, yes, the world is a mess, and some people listen to baby metal specifically to escape from it. That's fine. But I found myself this year, particularly given the state of the US at the moment, I find myself being drawn to baby metal less because it feels so separate from the world that I actually live in. And sometimes that's, as I say, sometimes that's appealing. And sometimes I kind of want them to I want them to pick a fight. It's interesting when I saw them most recently and they were being supported by Scene Queen, and some of the fans really didn't like Scene Queen. And that's fine. It's not particularly my kind of music. But some of the fans were saying, oh, she's a man hater. And that's something she talked about in the show. She's playing with men on stage and talks about how much she loves them. And about the fact that her songs were not against men, they were against misogyny and certain kinds of toxic behavior which was destructive. And I couldn't help thinking, if you think that's man-hating, that says to me a lot about what you think manhood is. And that's a problem. But the very fact that people who could think that were going to baby metal shows made me think, maybe baby metal need to stand up for what they believe in, and make it a little clearer what they believe in. I infer it, and you might not agree, about that sort of inclusivity and positivity and so on. But I'd like to see that underlined and made a little sharper, give them a bit of an edge. It's easy to all agree about sort of abstract principles and fighting for right, but we kind of maybe need to know what that right actually looks like. And I think AG are doing that a little bit more. So that's a cross-pollination I would actually really like. What would I like to see AG get from baby metal? I think that much as I like AG's recent stuff, it's musically not as rich as some of what they were doing early on when it was very jazz heavy, And I think that one of the great things that baby metal do is that their songs feel very layered, very technically complex in terms of the way the instrumentation works and such. And I would love to see that. And I'd love to see those sort of soaring vocals where they find that real melody line and lift it, That I'd love to see translate into Atarashi Gakko, who don't always get there, much as I love their stuff. But again, it's that sort of cross-pollination that I think could be really, really exciting. In terms of visuals, what can baby metal get from Atarashi Gakko? Man, in terms of choreography, I think that would be really interesting because they're very different. Baby metal, as I've said before, their choreography tends to be quite gestural. It's mostly waist up. A lot of it is hands and face. And whereas Atarashi Gakko are more fluid, more entirely sort of body-centered, and more varied in their approaches. And they are, I don't think there's any question that they are better dancers. This is obviously what they have been doing for a long time and inventing. And they are extremely skilled. And they have, the sort of the balletic and the jazz dance and the disco and the hip hop, and they can do all of that. And they have, different members of the group specialize in different ones. But I think that, that kind of variety is quite different from those more sort of static and demonstrative gestural dances that baby metal tend to do. But I think it could be really interesting to see them cross-pollinate and to see what happens. And maybe, it's a question of baby metal framing things visually and AG moving within that frame, or maybe they trade off in some ways. I think that could be really interesting. What else that could be good? Musically, I think, one of the things that the baby metal interviewers kept drawing attention to was how the energy of Atarashi Gakko, particularly the newer Atarashi Gakko. You know, the first two albums did have sort of ballady kind of songs on them, but they have steadily moved away from that into something that has more drive and more impact and is sort of relentlessly pounding, you know. I love that. If you could complicate it, add those sort of levels of richness and musicality that we get from some of the baby metal stuff and the heaviness of some of the instrumentation. Lately, a lot of Atarashi Gakko has been very digital, as I said, very keyboard, synthesizer heavy, but to bring in like real hard metal instrumentation, I think that could be really cool. But I think what I want more than any, and you know, I'd love to see a song. And I don't know what it would be like, right? One of the great things about a baby metal collaboration is that it's often hard to imagine until you hear it, you know, and then it makes perfect sense. And I think that something similar could happen here. And of course, visually, I think, you know, any kind of video or live show that included both of them, you know, in the same frame or on the same stage at the same time would be a lot of fun to see them sort of interact. And one of the great things that we were getting from the radio is a sense that they seem quite comfortable with each other. And though their personalities are obviously quite different, it was really interesting to hear baby metal sort of give place to Suzuka from Atarashi Gakko because her personality is so strong and that voice has such power to it, even on the radio, you know.
鈴鹿さん、ライブ中お客さんにダイブするのは怖くないですか？もう慣れた？最初から怖くなかった？そしてコツはありますか？
コツ
これ誰の質問ですか？
桃メタルちゃん。
桃メタルさん、ありがとう。
気になる。
そうですね。ライブでお客さんダイブするのは怖くないです。
怖くないんだ。
怖くないし、めちゃめちゃ楽しいし、私はこうね、ぶっ飛ぶ感覚大好きなので、楽しいって気持ちがあります。で、コツは、
コツって何？
コツは、まずビビらないってことがコツですね。なんか、やっぱ、お客さんのところに行かないと、どこに登れるかとか、どのお客さんがサポートしてくれるかとかも、その時の勘なんで、もうその時めちゃめちゃ野生的な感覚になるんですよ。あ、こいついけんな、みたいな。とか、いや、とりあえず手貸せとか、肩車してくれとか、あとね、登る時も、あ、ここグラグラしてんな。で、グラグラしてるけど、ね、サポートしてくれるよね、君、みたいな感じで、手をこう柵につかませて、君がサポートするんだって。お客さんもなんか、オッケーみたいな、任せろその一体感も好きなんでね。だからその瞬間瞬間のその感覚を研ぎ澄ませるっていうのが一つのコツかな。
コツ。面白いね。
桃メタルちゃんはダイブしたい願望があるってことですか？
ダイブ志望。でも、見てて、なんかそのアトラクションとか結構好きなので、なんかそういうワクワクするのを、まあ、ちょっとやってみたかったりはするんですけど、ただちょっと怖い。
そうですね。やっぱこの規模でライブができるようになったっていうのと、コロナも明けたっていうので、お客さんとより深くぶつかりたいっていう気持ちがあったのかもしれないですね。はい。素敵です。
But I think what I'd like to see more than anything else is a live tour, you know? I mean, every time Baby Metal tour, you look at the fan discussion, and one of the first things people say is, the support act is what now? You know, I mean, I said I was quite pleasantly surprised by seeing Queen, even though it's not my kind of stuff. But I really hated Dethklok. And I thought that tonally, it was way off base for Baby Metal. And some of the other collaborations which have been talked about lately, you think, really? That's who you want to partner with? You know, the ambience, the associations of some of these artists, that's what we want to do? That doesn't seem to me to be a good match. That would not be the case with Atarashi Gakko. And having seen both bands live a couple of times, I think that would be, you know, a really, really fun tour. The only possible downside is that having two bands together, joint headlining might reduce the playing time of each, but I don't think it needs to, you know. I mean, both of them are playing for about an hour. That seems to me perfectly doable, right, with a joint headliner. AG, in the last couple of US tours, have not had a support act at all, so it would require a certain amount of shifting, but it seems to me perfectly doable, and I think that would be so much fun. and the ethos of the two bands, the sense of what they are about, and the slightly different but compatible versions of Japan that they are presenting to the West, I think would be really cool and interesting. And the very fact that they're doing these radio things suggests to me that they're looking to tap into each other's fan base and build, right? And they're not the only ones. Polka Dot Stingray have been doing a bunch of like self-radio interview chatty kind of things as well lately. And I wonder what this means. But I see a tremendous amount of frustration in various artistic communities, music, but also in books and visual art, about how true artists are getting squeezed out by AI and by the sheer proliferation of clutter and the sort of the TikTok world of endless bits of stuff getting fired at audiences, so much so that it's harder and harder for real artists to retain a hold of their audience's imagination and attention, and of course money, right? So, you know, the very fact of this radio show I think is interesting because it seems like an expansion. You know, I've often heard Japanese people say baby metal are bigger outside Japan than in it. And when you see those huge concerts, you think, well, how can that be? But there is a sense of that, I think, sometimes. And I've also heard Japanese people say that the version of Japan manifested by baby metal feels like a Japan which is being offered to foreigners, right? That high epic samurai tradition, that Nihon Teki kind of a version of Japanese life rather than the stuff of it. Whereas Atarashi Gakko are more engaged in contemporary Japan and representing of contemporary Japan with some of its problems as well as, you know, the sort of the things that people in the West might idolize or fetishize. So to me, that's interesting. I was the one disappointment that I had was that when they were talking so much about collaboration in the first episode, I was kind of hoping that by episode 3, we were going to get an announcement. And we didn't. It never got more than superficial, yeah, let's work together. Would that be great? I don't know what the strategy, of course I don't know what the strategy is, whether this is a setup for some kind of announcement on Fox Day or somewhat later on. I don't know. But this is the best idea for a tour that I have heard as far as baby metal is concerned. I think it's a better idea than Hanabiye or the other bands I mentioned before, Love Bites and Bandmade and stuff, who all have quite distinct feels. But I don't think they're as actually simpatico in terms of what baby metal are all about. Maybe this is just me, but I have a different sense of the ambience, you know, and I think that this particular pairing would be really, really, really great. And I think that's all I have to say. So that's it. As ever, please like, comment, subscribe, check out my books, of course. Check out my Patreon page, and again, a special thank you to my patrons who have stuck with me and continue to support this channel, which is the only way that I make anything directly from it, because the channel is not monetized. I also have merchandise, such as this shirt, which is my 2025 This Is How I Feel About This Year kind of shirt. Man, we need good music. So I'm hoping that we're going to get new albums soon. If only because then I'll have things to talk about. All right, that's all. Cheers. Thank you. I will talk to you soon.